Growing up, I always thought of my grandfather as one of those quiet men who spoke in actions more than words. He built things with his hands: wooden furniture, a greenhouse out back, even a small boat that never saw water. He wore flannel, whistled while he shaved, and cooked the best grilled cheese I've ever had. But he was also private. The kind of man who kept his past tucked neatly away, like old receipts in a drawer he never opened. When he passed, he left behind more tools than clothes, more scraps of wood than photographs. My dad said that's just how he was. Simple. Didn't dwell on things, he told me. But when we started cleaning out his garage-turned-storage room, I found something that complicated everything we thought we knew about him. There was an old leather suitcase tucked beneath a pile of blankets. It wasn't hidden exactly, just placed carefully like someone had meant to come back to it. It was heavy, the metal clasps stiff with age. I clicked them open, half expecting more tools, or maybe old war stuff. But instead, it was full of letters. Hundreds of them. Some were in envelopes, some loose and folded, all yellowed around the edges with time. The first few were from my grandmother. Sweet, dated in the early 60s, full of updates about the house, the kids, the weather. I set those aside, smiling at how proper her handwriting was. Then I found a stack of letters tied with a thin, black ribbon. No return address. No envelope. Just paper. Soft from decades of folding and unfolding. The top one began with, "You looked at me like it meant something. I haven't stopped thinking about that. It stopped me cold." The handwriting was more angular, more precise than my grandmother's. Masculine. Curious, I kept reading. "I know we agreed not to write anymore after the cabin. I know you said it was safer that way, but I had to tell you. What we had, it wasn't nothing. You can call it whatever you want. But when you held my face in your hands that night, I believed you, even if you'll never say it out loud." I reread that paragraph 5 times. The signature at the bottom was just one letter. T. I sat there in the dusty garage for what felt like hours, holding that letter like it was something sacred. It felt wrong to read it, but it also felt wrong to stop, so I didn't. I read more, one after another. They weren't graphic or romantic in the traditional sense, but they were tender, honest, devastating in a way. They talked about fishing trips and rainy nights in a one-room cabin somewhere near Lake Michigan, about jazz records and borrowed sweaters and quiet mornings, about stolen glances in public that meant more than whole conversations, and my grandfather, stoic, reserved, simple Grandpa Joe, had saved them all, tied them together, preserved them. I found one dated July 1971 that was different, longer, desperate. "I waited for hours at the station. You didn't come. Maybe that's the answer. Maybe you've made your choice. I won't write again, not because I don't love you, but because I do. And I know what that costs you." There were no letters after that one. I sat on the floor, hands numb, letters scattered around me like confetti at a funeral. My mind spun with questions I'd never get to ask him. Who was T? Where was that cabin? Did anyone else know? But what struck me most was that my grandfather, so private, so proper, had chosen not to destroy them. He had kept these letters through a lifetime, tucked away like a secret that still mattered, even decades later. And for the first time, I felt like I was meeting the real version of him, the version he never got to be. I couldn't stop thinking about the letter. Not just what it said, but why it existed at all, why it had been saved, why it had been buried in a suitcase beneath old blankets, as if Grandpa Joe had wanted someone to find it, but only after he was gone. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying lines in my head, especially that one. "You looked at me like it meant something." I'd never heard anyone talk about my grandfather like that. Not romantically, not with that much ache behind the words. And whoever T was, He hadn't been a passing fling. This wasn't some lost crush. These were letters that spanned years. From the late 50s all the way to 1971. 14 years of writing. 14 years of… what? Loving each other from afar? Secret rendezvous? It didn't add up. I grabbed the letters I'd set aside, the ones from my grandmother. They were dated earlier than T's, mostly from before they got married. After 1960, they stopped. A few birthday cards, some notes on the backs of photos. But nothing personal. Nothing like the letters from T. It was like she'd stopped writing, and T had started. What if there was overlap? I hated that my first instinct was to judge, to think of this like some betrayal. Because the more I read, the more I realized it wasn't that simple. This wasn't a love triangle. This was a life half-lived in silence. The next morning, I sat at the dining room table with the letter still in my lap, turning it over like I was hoping the paper would give me more answers if I stared hard enough. My dad walked in, still wearing his funeral suit, hair messy, eyes tired. "You've been up all night?" he asked, nodding toward the mess of letters. "Yeah, I found these in the garage. Thought they might be important." He sat down with a groan, pouring himself coffee without asking. I didn't know how to bring it up, so I didn't. Not at first. After a few minutes of silence, I asked, "Did Grandpa have a friend named Tom? Or maybe Theo?" My dad blinked. "What?" I found letters. From someone who signed them just T. From the 60s and 70s. They're personal. He frowned. "Personal how?" I hesitated. Then I pushed the folded letter across the table. He picked it up slowly, read the first paragraph, and stopped. For a long moment, he just stared at it. Then he said, "Well, damn." I waited. "I don't know anyone named T," he said finally. But I'm not surprised. Not really. He was hard to read. Especially after Mom died. "He kept all of these," I said. "He tied them together." Dad didn't say anything for a while. Then, quietly, "Maybe he couldn't say it out loud. So he saved the part of his life that felt real, even if it had to stay hidden." I hadn't expected that answer, but it fit. Later that day, I went back to the suitcase and flipped through every letter looking for a clue. I found one postmarked from a small town in Michigan, Sutton's Bay. The name didn't mean anything to me, but it came up in a few other letters too. Cabin trips, a fishing spot, a diner with the best damn cherry pie in the state. Then I found a letter written in pencil instead of pen, dated 1965, and for the first time, T had signed a full name. "All my love, Thomas." I held that letter like it was a live wire. Thomas. Not just an initial anymore. A full name. The only one in over a decade's worth of letters. Maybe he'd slipped. Maybe he stopped caring. Or maybe something had changed in their relationship that year. Enough to make T into Thomas. The letter itself wasn't dramatic. It was quiet, almost reflective. It talked about the lake, how the trees looked in early October, how the wind made the dock creak at night. But there was a line that stopped me cold. "You left your sweater here again. I'm not going to mail it. That smell? It's too much of you. Let me keep something this time." It made my chest ache. I don't know why. Maybe because I'd never seen this version of my grandfather before. A man who made someone else feel like home. A man who left his sweater behind like a lover in a rush. It was more romantic than anything I'd experienced in my own life. I looked up Sutton's Bay. Small town. Population barely over 1,000. Pictures showed a sleepy lakeside community with white piers, old lighthouses, and postcard blue water. It didn't seem like the kind of place you could go without being noticed. If Thomas had lived there for decades, someone would remember him. I made a decision. One I didn't tell my dad about. 3 days later, I was on the road. A 6-hour drive north. Nothing but my grandpa's letters, an old GPS, and a knot in my chest that I couldn't explain. Maybe it was foolish. Maybe I wouldn't find anything. but something about those letters had gripped me in a way I couldn't let go. I needed to know who Thomas was. For my grandfather. For myself, Sutton's Bay looked exactly like the photos. Quiet, peaceful. A few tourists wandered the main street, ducking into antique shops and ice cream parlors. I grabbed lunch at a tiny diner called Mabel's, the name of which came up in one of the letters. I figured it was as good a place to start as any. The waitress, a woman in her 60s with curly gray hair and kind eyes, brought me coffee and a turkey melt. I waited until she refilled my cup before I asked, "Hey, this is going to sound strange, but do you know anyone around here named Thomas? Lived here a while back. Maybe went by Tom." She smiled politely. "Honey, that's half the men in town." "You got a last name?" I hesitated. "No, just that he might have had a cabin near the lake in the 60s. He was friends with my grandfather." Her eyes lingered on me for a second longer than I expected. "You said the 60s?" she asked. "Yeah," she chewed her lip. "You might want to check with the Historical Society. They've got records on old properties, rentals, family cabins. Might find something there." I thanked her, paid, and drove to the modest little building marked Sutton's Bay Historical Center. Inside, it smelled like old paper and varnish. A man with thick glasses and a plaid vest greeted me at the desk. "I'm looking for cabin records near the lake from the 1960s, I said, trying to keep my voice casual. He raised an eyebrow but nodded. "That's a specific window. Anything in particular you're hoping to find?" "A man named Thomas. Or maybe Tom. My grandfather used to come up here. I think they met around then." The man tapped his chin. "You know, there was a Thomas Delaney. Had a cabin just north of the bay. Taught at the high school for a while. Didn't have any family as far as I remember." My stomach flipped. "Is he still around?" "Passed away back in 2004, I think. Quiet guy. Lived alone. A lot of folks thought he might have been a bachelor by choice, if you catch my drift." I caught it. "Was the cabin his?" "Originally a rental, but he bought it eventually. Stayed till the end. Kept to himself, mostly. But there was always this story." He trailed off like he wasn't sure he should say it. "What story?" The man gave a small shrug. "Folks used to say he had someone. A man who used to visit every summer. No one ever met him, not really. Came in and out, stayed a week or two. Then gone. Always just gone." My chest tightened. I didn't need confirmation. I already knew. It was my grandfather. The guy at the historical center gave me directions to the old Delaney place. It wasn't far. Just a 15-minute drive down a winding road lined with pines and wildflowers. I followed the curves, each turn taking me deeper into the kind of quiet you can only find near water. The cabin sat tucked behind a small bluff, barely visible from the road. It wasn't much. Weathered wood siding, a crooked porch, and a narrow dock that stretched out into the stillest lake I'd ever seen. The kind of quiet that felt sacred. Like even the birds knew to keep their voices down. I parked and just stood there for a moment, staring. The cabin looked abandoned, but not forgotten. The windows were dusty but unbroken. The porch swing, though sagging, still moved a little in the breeze. Someone had cared for this place once. And that someone had loved my grandfather. I don't know what I expected. Some kind of epiphany? A ghost to appear in the doorway and hand me the rest of the story? But what I felt wasn't clarity. It was ache. The kind that sits in your chest and pulses slow. I walked around the side of the house, stepping over mossy stones and tall grass, and found a narrow path that led to a bench near the edge of the lake. It looked handmade, old, and familiar. Then I remembered. One of the letters Thomas had written. "I built us a bench. It's nothing fancy, but it faces the sunset. I figured if we only get 2 weeks a year, we better make the most of every moment." I sat down. And I don't know why, but I started talking out loud. To Thomas. To my grandfather. To both of them. I don't know why you had to hide, I said, my voice shaking even though no one was around. I'm sorry you had to love each other in secret. I'm sorry the world didn't make space for you. A breeze rolled off the lake. Warm. Soft. Like a hand brushing the back of my neck. And then, tucked in the crevice of the bench, I noticed something wedged between two boards. It looked like paper. Carefully, I slid it out. It was brittle and folded in quarters. A single page, written in the same handwriting I'd come to recognize from the suitcase letters. Thomas. Only this time, it wasn't addressed to him. It was from him. If someone finds this and you know Joe, my Joe, then you know how he smiled without showing his teeth, how he hated to talk politics, and how he always held the steering wheel with both hands, like it meant something. He was my favorite thing, even if I only got him in borrowed time. I didn't cry, not right then. Instead, I sat with that page in my hand, staring at the lake, and felt something shift in my chest, a weight I hadn't even known I was carrying. Because the story wasn't about secrets, it was about the love they managed to have anyway. I sat on that bench for what felt like hours. The folded note from Thomas rested in my lap, edges frayed, ink faded in places. I kept reading that line over and over. He was my favorite thing, even if I only got him in borrowed time. There was a grief in those words that transcended the years between them and me. The kind of grief that didn't just come from losing someone, but from never getting to fully have them in the first place. And I couldn't stop thinking about how many years my grandfather spent with a part of himself locked away, not just from his family or his friends, but from the version of the world that would have allowed him to say, I love him out loud without fear. Back in the car, I didn't drive anywhere. I just sat with the engine off and stared at the cabin until the sun began to dip behind the trees. I imagined them there, Joe and Thomas, spending a few stolen weeks each year, pretending for just a little while that their world was different, that it didn't end when the calendar told it to. What kind of strength does that take? What kind of love survives that kind of silence? That night, I checked into a small motel in town. I laid all the letters out on the bed like puzzle pieces and began sorting through them again, this time more deliberately. I was looking for something, not just clues, but moments, patterns. I wanted to understand their story, not just their timeline. And then I saw it. Tucked into the corner of one of the envelopes was a photograph. It was small, square, and slightly curled at the corners. Two men sat on the porch steps of a cabin, the same one I'd just visited. One of them was my grandfather, a younger version, smiling in a way I'd never seen before. Not the polite smile he wore in family pictures, but something softer, something freer. The man beside him, Thomas, I had to believe, had his arm resting behind my grandfather's back, casual, but close. Their legs touched. Their heads leaned just slightly toward each other. It wasn't romantic, not openly, but it was intimate. The kind of photo two straight friends would have taken and tossed in a box without a second thought. But for them, it was everything. A snapshot of a world that didn't quite belong to them, but one they'd carved out anyway. On the back, in faded ink, someone had written, July 68, best week of my life. I stared at it until my eyes burned. That night, I didn't sleep. I thought about all the things we never say to each other, about the stories that don't get passed down, because they were too dangerous, too complicated, too queer for polite company, and how many lives we live in secret, even from ourselves. The next morning, I drove back to the cabin. I don't know why. Maybe I needed to say goodbye. Maybe I just wanted to see it in the daylight one more time, the place where this hidden part of my grandfather's life had actually lived, where it wasn't just memories tucked into paper, but moments that had been real, felt, breathed. The sun was high, the lake glittering like a mirror. I walked the edge of the dock, shoes crunching against the old wood. For a brief second, I imagined him there, Grandpa Joe, sitting cross-legged with his sleeves rolled up, skipping rocks while Thomas handed him a beer and made some dry joke that only he would laugh at. It was a silly thought, but it made me smile. I brought the photograph with me. I set it gently on the bench beside me and placed a small flat stone on top so the wind wouldn't carry it away. That photo felt like a bridge. Proof of something nobody else in the family ever knew existed. Maybe something even he had tried to forget. Or, more likely, something he tried to protect. That was the thing I couldn't get past. He'd kept the letters, he'd saved the photo, he'd tucked them away where someone like me might one day find them. He didn't destroy them. He didn't erase that part of himself. And I realized, maybe he wanted to be found. Back home a few days later, I sat down with my dad. I didn't show him all the letters. Not yet. But I showed him the photo. He studied it for a long time, brow furrowed, thumb slowly tracing the edge of the image. "This him?" he asked softly. "Thomas?" I nodded. "I had no idea," he said. "None." There wasn't judgment in his voice, just surprise, and something else too, maybe regret. "I don't think anyone knew," I said. "Maybe that's why he saved this. So someone eventually would." Dad looked out the window. He used to disappear for a week or two every summer. We thought he was just going on fishing trips. Said he liked the quiet. He turned back to me, eyes misty. "You think they were?" "I think they loved each other," I said, "in the only way they could." He nodded once, then looked at the photo again. "He looks happy here. I don't think I've ever seen him smile like that." "Me neither." We sat there in silence for a long time. Then Dad said, "You should keep it. The letters too. If he saved them this long, I don't think he'd want them lost." And that's when I knew something had shifted between us. Not just with Grandpa Joe, but between me and my dad. An unspoken understanding had taken root. It wasn't just about the past anymore. It was about the stories we choose to tell, and the ones we choose to carry forward. A week after I got home, I scanned every letter and photo. I labeled them by year, arranged them into folders, backed them up on 2 different drives. Not because I wanted to share them with the world, but because I knew how fragile memory could be. I didn't want to lose this again. Didn't want this story, their story, to vanish like so many others had. I kept the originals in a small wooden box, not unlike the one I'd found them in. Some nights, I'd read a few before bed. I'd sit cross-legged on my floor with a lamp and a drink and just let their voices wash over me. There was something almost cinematic about their letters, like pieces of a life that never got to play out in the open. They'd talk about weather and jazz records and sunsets over the lake, but beneath every line was this current of restrained yearning. It made me think about how much of ourselves we edit for the people around us, and how much gets left unsaid when the world doesn't give you the space to say it. One letter, dated late summer of '69, stood out more than the rest. It wasn't any longer or more dramatic, but it ended with something I hadn't seen in any of the others. "If the world had been different, you'd be mine. Every Sunday morning, every Monday night, not just July, not just borrowed time." That line gutted me, because I finally understood what it meant to love someone in the margins, to hold on to fragments instead of full pages. I thought about the way my grandfather held himself his whole life, quiet, respectful, proper, and how much of that might have been armor. How maybe all that silence wasn't just his personality, but protection. And still, in spite of that, he kept the letters. He chose not to forget. And now I wouldn't either. A few months later, I made a quiet trip back to Sutton's Bay. The leaves had started to turn, the lake chilled and still. I brought with me a small framed copy of that photo, the one of him and Thomas on the cabin steps, and left it inside the porch window, tucked behind the screen. No note, no explanation. Just a little piece of them returned home. As I walked back down the trail, I turned for one last look. The cabin stood quiet in the afternoon light, its porch empty, the dock stretching out like a hand waiting to be held. And I thought about all the lives we never get to see fully, the ones lived behind closed doors, between folded pages, beneath borrowed names, and how sometimes the greatest love stories are the ones no one ever knew were happening.